The dawn of the personal computer age really started around 1977 with the introduction of the Commodore PET, Apple II, and TRS-80. These were the first truly affordable computers that didn't require a customer to assemble it from a kit. All three of these computers had some success in the education market, but during the 1980s, Apple managed to almost completely take over the educational market from Commodore, Tandy, and even IBM. And this strategy was good for Apple as it meant that students who learned on Apple computers might be more likely to buy an Apple themselves when the time came. The Apple II series was manufactured from 1977 all the way to 1993, and that's around 16 years, a pretty impressive lifespan. Even the Commodore 64 didn't last that long. Of course, in 1984, Apple introduced the Macintosh, which they figured would eventually replace the Apple II. However, sales weren't what they initially hoped, and the Apple II continued to keep the company afloat for many years after its introduction. In 1986, Apple released the successor to the Apple II, the Apple IIGS. Now, this was a 16-bit computer, and while it does bear the name of the Apple II series, it's actually almost a completely different architecture, featuring vastly improved graphics and sound and a faster CPU, and just about everything about it was improved. However, there's one particular chip I want to bring to your attention. All of the chips on the board are labeled with their function. So for example, this one says it's for sound, these here say they're ROM, this one's clearly a graphics chip, and so on. But what is this chip here labeled Mega 2? Well, believe it or not, this chip basically contains almost an entire Apple IIe motherboard on a single chip. Now that doesn't include things like the CPU and RAM, but basically everything else. Now, this chip allowed the Apple IIGS to be backwards compatible with software for the original Apple II series. However, as you can see by the timeline here, the Apple IIGS never entirely replaced the Apple II systems, and in fact, ironically, it was discontinued a year before the IIe. Apple also had a really expensive desktop called the Macintosh II, but it saw very little success in the education market. Many school districts had invested heavily in the Apple II and IIGS systems, and the vast majority of software they used in the classrooms was designed for the original Apple II. And so it could be difficult to convince some schools to upgrade to Macintosh computers because they would no longer be able to use the large library of Apple II software. In 1990, Apple released the Macintosh LC, which stands for low cost, and this finally gave schools, businesses, and home users an option for a Macintosh computer that had color and an affordable price tag. But the LC also had something else. Inside it had something called a PDS slot. In time, there would be a variety of peripherals designed for the slot, including Ethernet cards and processor upgrades, and of course, the topic of this video, the Apple IIe card. Taking a closer look at the card, this large chip here is called the Gemini chip. Now this is actually a slightly revised version of the Mega 2 chip that I showed earlier in the Apple IIGS. So again, it's basically most of the logic chips of an Apple IIe combined into a single chip. This next chip here is a 65C02 microprocessor. Now it looks a little different from the earlier models because it's in a square package instead of the usual DIP package. And over here is 256K of RAM. Now apparently 128K is used by the Apple IIe system, and the other 128K is used by the Macintosh side for some reason or another that I don't fully understand. And this chip over here is called an IWM, or an integrated WAS machine, which is basically a disk drive controller all integrated into a single chip. And so that's all the important stuff on the card. Now what I'm going to do next is go ahead and install this into my Macintosh LC2 so we can try it out. On the back here, it has a proprietary connector where you can install this breakout cable, and one of the cable ends is for connecting to an Apple II disk drive, and the other end is for connecting to an Apple II joystick. Now I'm going to go ahead and connect up a 5 1/4 inch floppy drive here, since most Apple II software was distributed on this format. However, these drives can be daisy-chained. In fact, you can connect up to 3 drives to it, like this, including the 3.5 inch drives. And you can also make use of the internal disk drive as well, which technically makes 4. Okay, let's fire this thing up. I'm going to put in a fresh copy of the Oregon Trail. Unfortunately, I don't have an original of this disk. And I've already got the necessary software installed on the Mac, so I'm just going to start the IIe application. And there we go. So there's a few things I want to tell you about this. First of all, this always runs full screen. It cannot run in a window. Plus, the Macintosh is no longer multitasking any other applications during this time. Now, while the card is technically running the software on real hardware, it's not an emulation as such. The video, however, is technically emulated. The video is drawn by the Macintosh, and it is actually a little slower than the real video system on an Apple II. The audio, on the other hand, works a bit differently. I noticed something recently when looking at the schematics of an LC system that I was troubleshooting. This section here is basically the audio portion of the schematics, and this part here is the main sound chip, and its output goes down here to the amplifier portion of the circuit. But if we take a closer look at just the amplifier, you can see it has two sound sources, and the first one comes from the Macintosh's sound chip, and the second one down here actually says it comes from the PDS slot. So that means the Apple IIe card produces its own sound, and it goes straight to the amplifier. Anyway, let's see if we can set up a party here on the Oregon Trail. I'll enter my name as the 8-bit guy. It appears it won't accept numbers, so I'll have to spell it out. And I'll need some other people. Let's add LGR and Techmoan. And let's do Dr. Mix. Okay, well that won't fit, so I'll shorten it. Okay, and we need one more. How about Look Mom No Computer? And that sure won't fit, so I'll have to abbreviate that too. Okay, so we're going all the way back to 1848. I can only imagine the five of us trying to survive in that time. Anyway, if you want to exit the IIe session, you can press Control, Apple, and then Escape. And this will bring up the Preferences menu. And there are actually quite a few things that you can configure here about your emulated Apple IIe. For one thing, you can actually substitute native Mac sounds for the simple Apple II beep. And over here you can set up memory expansion for the Apple II. And this will actually use a RAM from the Macintosh to emulate the memory expansion board. And you can pick anything from 256K to 1 megabyte. And here you can change the settings for mouse emulation. Although I'm not even sure I have any Apple II software that uses a mouse to even test this with. And there are various other things you can configure. This is one of the more interesting ones, slots. This allows you to select a startup slot, but more importantly, you can move things around. So these slots represent the 7 expansion card slots that you would have on an Apple II motherboard. And you can move things around to better suit certain software configurations, although most software is standardized on a certain layout, so I'm just going to leave it as is. And here's SmartPort. This emulates a SmartPort card, and you can select what sort of drives you would like the Macintosh to emulate. Right now, drive 1 is the internal drive on the Macintosh LC, and then I have 2 ProDOS partitions mounted as well. Anyway, let me try some other software. Here is Donkey Kong, and I actually can't figure out how to control this. I think it requires a joystick, which I don't currently have plugged in because at the moment I can't find my Apple IIc joystick. Well, let's try something other than a game. I want to see if AppleWorks will load. We actually used this software back in my junior high in the computer lab on our Apple II systems, mostly for the word processing features so that we could type in our essays and things like that. However, it does work in 80 columns mode, and I wanted to see how that looked. It wants me to put in a date. I guess it's a good opportunity to see if AppleWorks is year 2000 compliant. So I'll just put in August 22nd of 2019. And nope, it doesn't like that. So I guess we'll put in March 20th, 1986. Okay, well, other than that, it appears to be working fine. The 80 columns is actually more readable here than it would be on the original composite monitors. Of course, that's the thing about the video here. The video looks almost too good, and that's because it is being emulated, and thus it looks almost just like a modern emulator. So I want to try a few other things, including BASIC. I'll just write a little program here. Okay, now one of the things I wanted to try was increasing the speed. So apparently the emulated Apple II can run at 1 megahertz or 1.9 megahertz. So I'm going to put it into fast mode. Surprisingly, I don't see much difference here, and I suspect that's because the bottleneck here is the screen drawing routine, which I have read is actually slower than a real Apple II, so maybe some other programs that do more number crunching would speed up more. There's another interesting feature I want to try. I'm going to load up Ultima IV here, and this looks really great. I mean, better than it would on a real Apple II, I believe. Anyway, you can change it to a monochrome monitor, which would certainly be useful for some applications, but I just wanted to see how Ultima would look. And yep, this is exactly how I would expect it to appear on a monochrome monitor with the vertical striped lines instead of colors. And I did a whole episode on how Apple II graphics worked, and if you haven't seen it, but it's really bizarre as all of the colors achieved by NTSC artifacts and timing gimmicks. And of course, the software here is having to emulate that effect on this RGB monitor. But it is really convenient to be able to change it on the fly like this. It's almost like having two different monitors for your Apple IIe. Speaking of monitors, the Apple II series had a resolution of 280 pixels across by 192 pixels tall. Or if you had the 80 column card, it could technically be double the horizontal resolution, making it 560 pixels. However, this creates an interesting situation with the LC series computers. Now, while they can technically display 640 by 480, the default and most common monitor used with the LC can only display 512 by 384. And so if you look at the numbers, you can see that the vertical resolution is perfect because the Mac is exactly double that of the old Apple II, so this is easy to scale. But the horizontal resolution is a different story. In fact, the LC monitor technically can't even display all of the pixels of the Apple II's 80 columns mode. They won't even fit. Now, Steve Jobs was very picky that Macs have square pixels, and with an aspect ratio of 4:3, that means you have to have 512 pixels to match. So how then was this situation handled? As you can clearly see the 80 columns mode working fine in AppleWorks as I showed earlier. Well, it turns out the LC and its monitor have a hidden graphics resolution of 560 by 384, and the only thing that can access this resolution is the Apple IIe card. Of course, the LC series was not the only computer that could run the Apple IIe card. In fact, another popular computer that has a PDS slot is the Macintosh Color Classic. So I'll show you how we put the Apple IIe card inside the Color Classic. Just turn it around to the back and this little cover pops off. Then you just grab and pull. It requires no tools, similar to the LC series. And this particular board has an Ethernet card sitting in the PDS slot. And since there's only one slot, you sort of have to decide which card you'd rather have. For the moment, we'll just put the Apple IIe card in its place. And then shove the board back in and replace the cover. And here we go, the Color Classic is up and running. I already have the IIe application installed, so we'll just start it up. I still have Ultima IV in the disk drive, and here it is on the tiny little color screen, and it looks absolutely fantastic, very sharp and bright. Again, this looks actually better than on a real Apple II. Now there's one thing I wanted to show you, this happens really fast, so I'm going to do a freeze frame right here. Notice that the screen appears to shrink and move over to the left very briefly. Well, this is the Color Classic also entering the special 560 by 384 mode, which was designed into the computer specifically for this purpose. So which other models will it work with besides the LC series and the Color Classic? Well, it also works with the Quadra 630 and the all-in-one LC 520. However, one limitation is that it does require System 6 through 7.5.5, so it won't run on anything newer. Also, there are some other Macs that will physically fit inside, but is not actually compatible due to those Macs being 32-bit or PowerPC Macs. This card sold for $250, which was actually a pretty good deal compared to buying an entire Apple II system at the time, which could easily cost 5 or 6 times that amount. And it's a pretty nifty piece of hardware, and it probably did help convert quite a few Apple II customers into Macintosh customers, which was part of the goal of this card. It's actually kind of a pity that Commodore didn't have a similar device for the Amiga, like the 1000 or 500, that would allow it to run Commodore 64 software, and I think that would have gone a long way towards helping to convert the Commodore 64 base into Amiga users a little faster. Anyway, that about wraps up for this episode, so as always, stick around for the next one, and thanks for watching.